Who is winning the battle for the soul of American conservatism? With some of the loudest voices on the right refusing to condemn anti-Semitism coming from their own side of the political spectrum, or even engaging in it themselves, what impact will that have on not just the Trump administration or the Republican Party, but for an American public square which is already awash in left-wing Jew hatred? Next on Think Twice, we'll discuss the future of American conservatism with Joel Pollak, one of the leading writers on the right at Breitbart.com, as well as discuss his book, The Zionist Conspiracy Wants You, about the transcendent importance and justice of Zionism and what the effort to demonize it means for America and the Jews. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation with Breitbart.com's Joel Pollak about the future of American conservatism and his book about Zionism. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. Is it fair for supporters of Israel, as well as opponents of anti-Semitism, to ask leading conservative commentators to speak out against those who are platforming anti-Semites or actively engaged in spreading Jew hatred? For some of them, like podcasters Megyn Kelly or Matt Walsh, such a request is unreasonable if it means forcing them to speak the truth about anti-Semites like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, whom they claim are personal friends or just people for whom they might have some sympathy. What's worse, they think there's something sinister about Jews or supporters of Israel to even ask them to do it, hinting that it's some sort of unfair conspiracy. Even worse than that, they're also invoking the name of the late Charlie Kirk as someone who sided with them on this issue. And since Kirk, who was a remarkable and in so many ways a laudable figure, whose assassination has elevated him to the status of secular saint on the right, this debate is causing dissension. It's also making it clear that as much as anti-Semitism is a much bigger problem on the left, it's also now seeking a toehold among mainstream conservatism. But with so many people on both ends of this political spectrum attacking Israel and Zionism, it's important to hear from someone who has given a great deal of thought to the question of why Zionism is an ideology that is not only important for Jews, but has major lessons for non-Jews as well. Joel Pollak is the senior editor-at-large at Breitbart News and hosts Breitbart News Sunday on Sirius XM Patriot 125. Born in South Africa and raised in the Chicago area, he's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the author of several books, including his most recent, The Zionist Conspiracy Wants You. Joel Pollak, welcome back to Think Twice.
I guess it's Think Thrice.
Yes, I guess. Or, however you want to put that. Joel, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about your book, The Zionist Conspiracy Wants You, which was originally written and published as an ebook back in 2021, I believe, but which was just reissued and published as an actual print book. Why do you think it's particularly important now, as the post-October 7th war may be coming to an end, and to have a discussion about Zionism?
I wrote the book after a conversation with some Zionist activists who were strategizing about how to make the case for Israel more relevant to a younger generation of Americans. And it became clear to me that it is, in fact, difficult not to make the case for Israel against the Palestinians or against its various critics in the West, but simply to make the positive case for Israel to people who might otherwise be completely disinterested. There's no large constituency for interest in Israel and the Middle East outside of the Jewish community and the evangelical community. Of course, there are American interests involved, and people argue that Israel's military achievements, its economic achievements, its scientific innovation all benefit the United States. And all of that is true. We have a common democratic culture. We have common values, common Judeo-Christian tradition. All of that is true. But it's not going to motivate somebody who's not interested in the topic already to take an interest in Israel. So I thought about the puzzle for a while, and I realized that what excited me about Israel was not necessarily its specifically Jewish character, although obviously that is important to me as a Jewish person. But one of the things I enjoy about supporting Israel is a sense that I'm actually connecting to something universal through my support of Israel. And what that universal thing is a sense of accomplishment that is exemplary in a civilizational way. That there was this group of oppressed Jews, the poorest people in the world, many of whom would, within generations, be murdered by the Nazis, who decided to take it upon themselves to leave the Pale of Settlement in Russia, to leave Eastern Europe, to leave parts of North Africa and the Middle East, and to come to what was then Palestine, where there had been Jewish communities continuously for millennia, but where they had been small and where they had lived as second-class citizens, and to rebuild a Jewish republic. And the transition or the change from oppressed, victimized, marginalized people to strong, confident, innovative leaders of the world is so profound. It's not necessarily unique to Jews and to Israel, although I do think that Israel has a unique story. The lessons of Israel can apply universally. And so I thought, well, what if we took the word Zionism, which people sometimes shy away from? It's often used as a pejorative by anti-Semites on the left and the right. What if we take that word and we make it a common noun rather than a proper noun? In the same way that, to use perhaps an unflattering analogy, Bolshevik can now be used lowercase b, or people often use the word, and it is an English word in common usage, Catholic, with a lowercase c. The Catholic Church is an institution. To be Catholic in a lowercase c sense is to be, in a sense, socially democratic, not in a social democratic political sense, but in a sense to be open, to be available,
That
accessible.
is what the word means, yes.
Right. So Zionist, in my telling in this book, is not just about the establishment of the modern-day state of Israel, but to be Zionist is to achieve one's goals through a process of self-transformation. In the same way that Jews became Israelis and thereby created one of the most successful political projects of the last several centuries, people can take challenges in their own lives, or groups or political movements can take the challenges that they are facing, and through a process of change that they themselves direct, they can actually achieve what might have seemed at some point to be impossible goals. So I talk about this on an individual level, how you can devise strategies for your life, almost in a self-help sense. But I also talk about it in terms of familiar movements. I talk about, for example, how Black Lives Matter could be more Zionist. I even talk about how the Palestinians could be more Zionist, not just in the sense of embracing the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, which is the essence of political Zionism, but also to transform their own concept of themselves from victims who've been pushed off their land to leaders who are going to reinvent their society, to reject extremism, and to be at the forefront of a new Middle East. That might sound like a tall order in the midst of the rubble of Gaza and in the aftermath of October 7th, but it's the only way forward. And that's why I wrote the book. I thought, let's generalize and universalize the lessons of the Zionist experience so that everybody can understand and benefit from it and understand why Israel is so important in a general sense.
Yeah. Well, of course, the anti-Semitic left has succeeded to some extent in demonizing and delegitimizing Zionism as part of its woke ideology of intersectionality and settler colonialism. But, as you've just said, you see it as the blueprint for success that can be applied to other peoples, even the Palestinians. While it is the national liberation movement of the Jews, what does it specifically teach others if they are willing to listen?
It's fundamentally about looking past the idea of victimhood. It's not that you have to give up the idea that you might have suffered in the past. Israel has Yad Vashem, after all, the Holocaust Memorial, and it will be building many memorials in the years to come to those who died on October 7th, to the hostages who died in captivity and so forth. There are already makeshift memorials going up all over Israel. But that's not all Israel is. Israel is a forward-looking society, a society that thinks about the future, a society that leads in technology. This is really, to me, the most fascinating thing about Israel. Israel is the only industrialized society today of any significance that has a birth rate above replacement. Every other industrialized society has a birth rate less than replacement, which is defined as fewer than 2.1 children on average per woman. Even in the United States, we dipped below that level in 2008, and we have never returned to replacement. In fact, we are falling off a cliff almost the way Eastern European societies did after the fall of the Berlin Wall. When you have a high birth rate, or at least a birth rate that's above replacement, it shows that you are thinking about the future. You're investing in the future. You are taking on commitments to raise children, and you're also creating a loving society, a society that invests in children and family. And that's Israel. And we have lost that in the West. My friend Charlie Kirk, whom I actually introduced to politics and who I was with in Jerusalem in 2018 when the U.S. opened the Israeli embassy in Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's what he was trying to achieve in the last years of his life, was a revival of interest in traditional values and in family and in faith. And Israel embraces all of those things while also embracing high tech, embracing the military, and embracing a kind of ecumenicalism and tolerance. There are things, for example, that Charlie would say about Islam that no Israeli leader, Netanyahu, would never say, because Israel has to integrate a large Muslim minority within its concept, not only of itself as a nation, but within its concept of democracy. So Israel is forward-looking, innovative socially as well as economically and scientifically and politically, militarily. And I think it's refusing to see yourself as a victim. That's the essence of Zionism.
Yeah, I think that's very good. You go through in your book, sort of a whole checklist of things that Zionism can teach other peoples. Now, but of course, as I said, the demonization is never been greater of Zionism. And as someone who was born in South Africa and has an intimate knowledge of its post-apartheid politics, why do you think the left has been able to smear Israel as an apartheid state, despite the fact that, as we know, the Jewish state and apartheid era South Africa have almost nothing in common?
Well, as you said earlier, Israel has been placed into the category of settler-colonialist states, and that category has been demonized, has been defined as evil. Although I don't think anybody who believes that settler-colonial societies are evil actually really believes it in a way that involves any kind of personal commitment to that belief. People, for example, who believe that the United States was built on land stolen from indigenous peoples, they don't give back the land. I mean, they might read a declaration or an apology at the start.
And a land acknowledgement.
Yeah, land acknowledgement at the start of a public event, that kind of thing. But nobody's renouncing whatever it was that came from settler-colonial societies. There really is no alternative. That's the world we're living in. And you dig deep enough in the Middle East and you find, of course, that the Islamic societies of the region were achieved through empire, through conquest. I mean, there's no society in the world today, very few societies in the world today that weren't established through some sort of conquest. And so I think it's all a form of vanity. I mean,
no matter how, if you dig deep enough,
it's
there for everybody.
I mean, it's very few people are willing to perform the act of renunciation that this ideology demands, of giving up somehow the settler and colonialist aspects of it. And again, to be Zionist with a lowercase z is to take those things. Okay, let's say you don't like them. You have a legacy you don't like. Well, transform it into something positive. The idea, not the reality, unfortunately, but the idea behind post-apartheid South Africa was that the gains, which may have been ill-gotten, of South African wealth and prosperity under apartheid could be harnessed for good. They could be used to build a better society, a more equal society. That hasn't happened largely because of socialism and corruption and tribalism and other negative forces that unfortunately have spun out of control after the departure of Nelson Mandela from the political scene. But the essence of the idea is that what you've inherited from the past might be morally problematic, but that doesn't mean it can't be used in a positive way. None of that applies in the case of Israel. When you listen to people talk about Israel as a settler colonialist society, they don't say, and therefore it should work with the Arab population or the Palestinian population who are redefined here as indigenous, even though Jews are indigenous to Israel. But never mind. There's never any kind of positive content to that. It's just, as a settler colonialist society, it needs to be eradicated or destroyed or dismantled. Well, that is not how this works. It's not even how it worked in apartheid South Africa when it became post-apartheid South Africa. And again, I'm not accepting the analogy. I'm just saying this is such an extreme quote unquote remedy for the situation that I don't think people are taking it seriously really as a critique of settler colonialism. I think it is simply a negation of Jewish identity. And I think it has deep roots. I'm not a person who ascribes all of the anti-Israel criticism, or even most of it, to anti-Semitism. But I think one of the reasons it resonates is that there is a deep-seated cultural anti-Semitism that lingers in foundational texts, not just religious texts, but also philosophical texts. When I was a student at Harvard, I had to read Marx's essay on the Jewish question about 5 times until I eventually complained about it. But it's an essentially anti-Semitic text, and yet it's assigned to students as an important text in the development of Marx's idea of civil society and proletarian revolution, which is central to Marxism, but it's just riddled throughout with explicit and crude anti-Semitism. And nobody talks about trigger warnings at the start of that essay. Nobody apologizes for the anti-Semitic content of the essay. It's just taught. And I think that with that in the background to the analysis of what's happening in the Middle East, a lot of people don't think rationally even about the idea of a settler colonialist society. It's just about eradication. And that sad idea, unfortunately, also has a long pedigree.
Yeah, it does. And I think for even those who really do concentrate on settler colonialism, it's impossible to imagine the United States going away, like, and the 99% of the population that, came from elsewhere, handing the country over to, Native Americans, but Israel's low-hanging fruit. It's a little country. It's got only 10 million people. It's possible to imagine its destruction.
From afar, from a distance. When you go there, it's such a coherent and cohesive society. That's a very important point, by the way. When I've encountered anti-Zionist Jews, in their minds, I can't read their minds, but at least from the things they express, they seem to believe that Israel is a project very easily scrapped, that you could simply do away with it. Apartheid was easier to get rid of in South Africa because it was grafted onto a political system that already existed. There was already a South African society, a Union of South Africa, which then later became the Republic of South Africa under apartheid. But basically, you had an existing parliamentary democracy that happened to elect the party that instituted apartheid as a policy. But it was removed half a century later through democratic elections, and what remained underneath was still a deep democratic tradition, a deep tradition of Christianity in public life, a deep tradition of judicial independence, even if it had been under threat during the apartheid era. So you had all these institutions already. Well, they seem to think that if you somehow cancel Israel's identity, that it's easy to just get rid of. It's not. The Israeli society that we encounter today has been there for almost 150 years in its present modern form, and for thousands of years before that in its cultural roots. One other point just about settler colonialist societies. Palestinian society is itself a settler colonialist society, and not simply in the way that most Muslim societies are through conquest and conversion, but the Palestinian population as such, the Palestinian Arab population, is comprised of people who often moved to Palestine from elsewhere as Jewish settlers arrived. There were, of course, families, societies, groups that had been there for a long time, Arab and Muslim groups, as well as Christian groups. Yet the arrival of these Jewish immigrants who were building new cities, creating new industries, it did bring people in from surrounding societies who traveled and established homes for themselves in Palestine and acquired a Palestinian identity, Palestinian Arab identity, but they were very much settlers, or you could say migrants. There's just one more thought. I keep saying one more thought, but here really is one more thought. If you reject settler-colonialist society in its entirety, let me describe what an act of renunciation would look like. I mean, you've suggested, giving up the land, but how does one individual give up all of America? Or you can't really. But what does it actually look like? And we actually have an example of this. Zoran Mamdani, the Democratic Party nominee for mayor of New York, has a father who I encountered, at least through his work, a couple of decades ago. He is one of the most important intellectuals in the pro-Palestinian movement. And he's recently come out with a book about Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, who murdered hundreds of thousands of people and expelled Uganda's Indian population. It had an Indian middle class of Indian immigrants who had come from the subcontinent a century or so before and had become active in the trades and in professions, and they'd become wealthy. In fact, today in South Africa, for similar reasons, the wealthiest group of people in South Africa is not white South Africans, it's actually Indian South Africans. So they'd become very successful in Uganda through hard work and skill and determination and cultural factors. And so Idi Amin decided to kick them out and seize their wealth. Mamdani, the elder Mamdani, Mahmoud, has written a book, a biography. He's written similar things before, but he's really brought it all in this book about Idi Amin, where he justifies, in a sense, Idi Amin expelling the Indian population of Uganda, of which Mamdani himself was a part. He says, look, we sort of bought into this settler-colonialist society, and therefore he was right to get rid of us. And we moved on from it. We didn't nurture a sense of grievance about it because we sort of had it coming. And okay, Idi Amin might have been a murderer, but he was a legitimate expression of African nationalism, getting rid of the settler-colonialists. So if you're willing to renounce settler-colonialism, that is what it looks like. It means you're willing to embrace murderous racism as an alternative, if it presents itself in some politically legitimate way. And the son of that man is running to be the mayor of New York. So that could be rather interesting. A city established through a very early example of settler colonialism, $24 in beads and trinkets for the island of Manhattan. But there you go. I mean, that's what it looks like. It's absurd and it's completely immoral. So we have to work with what we got.
Yeah, I think it's this is a very good point to raise about Mamdani. But of course, the aftermath of October 7th has seemed to empower anti-Semites in a way that really nothing else has in our lifetimes. Despite the fact that Israel has, I think by a reasonable definition, won the war in Gaza, some would argue that Hamas has won the propaganda war, with so many believing the lies and the blood libels about Jews committing genocide, which is right part of the effort to demonize Zionism. Do you think, what, if anything, can Israel or American Jews to retake the initiative in this information war and reclaim Zionism from, these libels?
So let me address that in two ways. Firstly, what really was Hamas's achievement on October 7th? And you can say it achieved the recognition of a Palestinian state from Britain and France, Canada, Australia, Spain, Portugal, Norway. And Hamas can point to those acknowledgments or those recognitions as an achievement. And unfortunately, that's correct, even if a Palestinian state doesn't actually exist in reality. But the real enduring achievement of Hamas, and I put achievement in quotes, but what they see as the achievement is still October 7th itself, is the sense of fear that it sparked in Jewish communities all over the world. The anti-Semitism is the point. It is the point. Mm-hmm. And why is it the point? It's the point for the same reason that Students for Justice in Palestine celebrated the image of the terrorist paragliders. It's the reason they circulated a manual in which they said, this is the beginning. We all saw the images of the settlers running away. Settlers, by the way, referring to the kids at the Nova Music Festival, an infamous video clip of kids running across a field. The leader of Iran, the Ayatollah, used that video clip saying all the Zionists are running away. It's that sense that Jews were afraid, that Israelis were afraid, and that they were running. And it gave Hamas a belief that endures, even if Hamas itself doesn't endure, but the belief will endure among Israel's enemies, that Israel is in fact temporary. If you simply murder enough Israelis and frighten enough Israelis and Jews, then Israel will cease to exist. And how does it work with regard to anti-Semitism in the West? I recalled recently, I had breakfast with the Palestinian ambassador to South Africa about 20 years ago or so when I was living in Cape Town. And he said to me, a Holocaust could happen again in the United States. Now, one hears that from Jews who are partial to the view that it could happen anywhere. I don't think it could happen in the United States, but many Jews
Nor do I.
Many Jews say, look, they didn't think it could happen in Germany, it can happen in the United States. So the comment he made sounded at first as if he understood the Jewish experience in America from within. He understands that Jews have a kind of existential nervousness even about their place in America. But over the course of the conversation, it became clear to me he meant it as a threat, meaning that Jews could be made to feel very uncomfortable in Western societies unless they stop backing Israel. And so I think the anti-Israel movement and the pro-Palestinian movement until now has used anti-Semitism in the West as a means of leverage. It's part of the design. When you attack Jewish stores, when you boycott kosher food, when you tell Jewish students at UCLA they can't get to class unless they renounce Zionism. I mean, that is the point. The point is to use anti-Semitism, which they recognize as part of the legacy of the West, troubled legacy that, again, we have to move on from in a positive way, but they recognize it and they want to use it as a weapon. So the enduring achievement of October 7th is the idea that Jews can be made to feel afraid. And unfortunately, that is a reality, whether it's a fantasy or not. The feeling is a reality, and so it's something Israel will have to guard against for generations. It's the reason Israel has to have a buffer zone in Gaza. It's the reason that there has to be a very serious effort to dismantle what's left of Hamas and to rebuild a much more successful and forward-looking Palestinian society, both there and elsewhere. The other enduring problem of anti-Semitism, and this is where the book comes in, is on the right. So you and I have spoken about anti-Semitism on the left, which in many ways is an outgrowth of the general anti-Americanism of the left, the wokeism, the general idea that things that are successful and that are wealthy and that are free are morally suspect, and things that are oppressed, et cetera, are morally superior by virtue of that fact. That's sort of wokeism in a nutshell. And Israel is on the winning side of history, therefore it is evil. That's a left-wing view. The right-wing view is a little more complicated. Some of it is classic religious anti-Semitism, that is to say, a hatred of Judaism as a religion because of the tenets of the Jewish faith or the practices, real and imagined, of the Jewish faith. There's some of that. There's also, I think, a kind of primitive envy. You can dress it up in complicated foreign policy language, but it's a primitive envy of the agency of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu seems to attract a lot of this kind of hatred. There's an envy of the way he has performed as a statesman on the world stage. There's an envy of the fact that he's been a wartime political leader, an envy of the fact that he goes to war, fights for his country, and doesn't have to do quite as much debating about it as an American president might have to do. And I think there's an envy of the character of Israel as represented by Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, I'm not saying this because I think Benjamin Netanyahu is a perfect person or because there aren't questions I have about some of the policies that he's undertaken. I was recently at an off-the-record event with him, and I can't reveal what was said, but I'm a journalist, and I asked some tough questions, and some people were taken aback by some of the questions. The answers were excellent, by the way, but he's really a statesman, a world historical figure, and so is Donald Trump. But I think that there are people who envy that freedom of action. If I want to put it in perhaps more straightforward terms, Israel is a society where people are allowed to share public expressions of faith, where classic traditional values of motherhood and fatherhood are celebrated, where people who go to the military are heroes. And we have some of that still in our society, but the rest of the West has basically lost it. And I think many Americans who are starting to rediscover the value of things like nationhood and religion and family feel almost a sense of concern or worry or even envy that it's easy for Israelis to express a desire for those things and hard for Americans to do so because we have this suffocating political correctness. And then they look at Republican political leaders or conservative leaders who are very open about their admiration for Israel. And when they try to express the same sentiments about the United States, they often have to add certain qualifications and caveats, and they seem to equivocate. I think that's a misinterpretation of what's going on. I don't think there's an equivocation among conservative leaders about American nationalism or about an embrace of Christianity. It's just that the United States, from the beginning, even in the colonial era, was ecumenical in its approach to religion. It was not a society that focused on a particular religion. Israel, of course, has religious freedom for everybody, but it is the Jewish state. The United States has never been the Christian nation or a Christian nation. It has been the United States of America, which is devoted to certain Christian principles. I would argue that it is, in a sense, a Christian nation in a general sense. But I think, there's not going to be the same kinds of explicit connections of church and state that some people would like to see, at least in American society, if not in American politics. And they look at Israel and they say, why are they allowed to do it and we're not? So I think there's an anti-Semitism on the right. And I wrote the book knowing that that was coming in a way, which is why I gave it a provocative title of Zionist Conspiracy. You hear that more often on the right than you do on the left, that sort of phrasing. And the book is being reissued, republished in print, because that's so much more relevant right now. As there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism on the right, I think it's important to get people's attention and say, okay, you want to talk about a Zionist conspiracy. So do I. What is the Zionist conspiracy? The Zionist conspiracy is simply to succeed, and to succeed in the way that Israel has done. And you can do it too. You can join it. You can be part of it. You don't even have to have anything whatsoever to do with Israel or Jews or anything like that. But study Israel, learn from what Israel did, learn from what Jewish leaders did to make Israel successful, and you can apply the same lessons in your own life. What studying those examples will do is it will mean that you can't as easily hate Israel as you might have otherwise. One of my favorite examples of this is, just to come back to South Africa, which is where I'm from originally, and I've written about it a lot, spent a lot of time there. South Africa is one of the most anti-Israel societies, at least at an elite level. The South African political elites, economic, media elites are very anti-Israel generally. But Nelson Mandela was not. And people like to quote Mandela. First of all, there's a very popular misquote of Mandela. He never said that Israel was an apartheid state. He never said anything like that. He did say a lot of things about the Palestinians, and that's because in the years of exile, the African National Congress, the anti-apartheid movement, did engage in armed struggle, as they put it, and they cooperated with the Palestine Liberation Organization to some extent as organizations within the Soviet sphere. So they have an old alliance. So Nelson Mandela was very close to Yasser Arafat. He said a lot of pro-Palestinian things, but he also said a lot of pro-Israel things. And he wrote in his autobiography, in his memoir, Long Walk to Freedom, that when he launched the armed struggle against apartheid, he was inspired by Israel. He was inspired by Menachem Begin, who took up arms against the British in the post-Second World era when the British had excluded Jewish immigrants and condemned, unfortunately, many tens of thousands to return to Europe and die in the Holocaust. But he took up arms against the British, and that inspired Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela also worked with many prominent Zionists, some of whom had also fought in Israel for the independence of Israel when he was formulating his military strategy against apartheid. Now, that's a part of history that the left wants to completely eliminate. But one of the reasons I think Mandela never completely took the Palestinian side to the exclusion of the Israeli side was he had that experience of studying Israel's example and learning from it. And so I think if you study what Israel's done and you understand there are positive lessons that are universal, it becomes a lot harder to hate Israel.
I think that's very true. And, I think part of the disconnect between supporters of Israel and their opponents has been an unwillingness on the part of the latter to be honest about what it is that the Palestinians actually want. And I think this is particularly relevant now as the Trump administration seeks to preserve the ceasefire it helped broker in Gaza, and some of its figures seem willing to speak of Hamas and the Palestinians with a degree of moral equivalence with Israel, although that is not what President Trump is saying. Where do you see this situation heading?
Well, it's going to be very difficult going forward to achieve everything in Trump's 20-point plan, extremely difficult. However, what Trump does better, I think, than any leader that we've seen in decades, perhaps ever, is create a visual sense of where this is all going. And what jumps out at me from that 20-point plan is a vision of Gaza as Dubai on the Mediterranean, which is achievable. If you look at photographs of Dubai 40 years ago, there was nothing there. I think the first building to go up was a Hilton or a Toyota building, just completely bleak. There was nothing there. But I talk about this in one of the chapters in the book. The United Arab Emirates, through enlightened leadership, took an economy that was based on oil revenues, that was feudalistic, that was very hierarchical, and it managed to transform that country into an industrial hub, a center of trade and tourism and investment, a financial center. And it's not an ideal society in any way, but it is a self-transformed society. And that's what needs to happen in Gaza. So I think Trump gets it. In fact, there was a line he delivered toward the end of his speech in the Knesset where he hinted at exactly what I'm saying. I thought perhaps he's read the book or his speechwriter's read the book, but he talked about drawing positive examples from Israel's experience. And what were those positive attributes? They were growth. They were looking forward. They were hope and freedom. And look, it's very difficult to introduce those things, but Donald Trump has created a structure within which it could theoretically be possible. Now, there are problems in that the Arab and Muslim countries that are supposed to help provide security are afraid of Hamas, according to latest reports. They're reluctant to get into armed conflict with Hamas if they have to. They want Hamas disarmed before they do anything. Well, that's what Israel wanted to do as well. Israel wanted to disarm them, and the ceasefire was the result. So there are some puzzles along the way that have to be solved. I also think that this issue of moral equivalence is something of a problem. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. I do think, though, increasingly, the skeptics of a strong U.S.-Israel alliance are having something of a retreat at the moment. Their candidate, so to speak, the person who they seemed to think best represented their views, was Vice President J.D. Vance. Mm-hmm. And J.D. Vance has made it known that he is a non-interventionist. And even though he made a speech at the Non-Interventionist Quincy Institute in 2024 talking about how Israel was different, that we needed to support Israel, and it was the exception to the general rule of not getting involved too deeply in other countries' affairs. Even though he gave that speech, people felt that perhaps he's going to revert back to the isolationist posture once he becomes president or a presidential candidate. And I think he's dispelled a lot of that by going to Israel and not lecturing Benjamin Netanyahu, which I think the media wanted him to do, but rather supporting Netanyahu in a common set of aspirations and in saying explicitly what Trump had said, which was that if Hamas doesn't comply with the deal, it will be obliterated. That was J.D. Vance's word. Mm-hmm. That's not very non-interventionist. So again, I don't think people need to commit to intervention as a general principle of foreign policy, but I do think that the people who were against the United States coming into the war against Iran, the people who were against the United States backing Israel in its attack on Hamas, counterattack on Hamas, really, I think they've lost several times in a row now, and they're now on the losing side when Trump has had a major set of wins. And I think it has reduced their influence and voice. It's not that they don't exist and they're not going to play an important role, but they are out there. And I would just close this answer by making the following observation. The pro-Israel part of the MAGA constituency, whether it's Jews or evangelical Christians or simply a kind of diffuse support for Israel that's common among conservative voters in America, the pro-Israel part of that coalition is a huge part of the reason MAGA won. Now, any part of the coalition can say, without us, you wouldn't have gotten it done. I think that's true. Winning coalitions often bring people together from different backgrounds. Trump won Muslim voters in parts of Michigan. He also won pro-Israel voters, and he did that by making a very careful case. I asked a Republican Muslim official, actually, I said, and I can tell you who it was because he said it on the air. It's Bill Essayli, who was a state legislator, first elected Muslim in the California state legislature, happens to be a Muslim. Now he's the acting U.S. attorney for the Central District of California. He's the one going around busting all the anti-ICE rioters and so forth. But I said to him, you're a Muslim. How do you sit with Trump's support for Israel? And he said, I believe only Trump can create peace. And that's the case Trump made to Muslim voters. So Trump put this diverse coalition together. But now I feel like there are some in the isolationist wing who are saying, well, we have to get rid of this pro-Israel coalition because somehow they're toxic. They've decided that pro-Israel policy is unacceptable. Well, I'm sorry, you don't actually get to do that. And given that the pro-Israel wing has delivered one win after another to the MAGA movement and to President Donald Trump, it's actually the anti-Israel wing, such as it is. I think it's small but influential, but it's that wing that actually needs to consider whether it belongs in MAGA or not, because what they're proposing would actually break apart the movement and break apart the coalition and make it impossible to win again in future. This coalition has to find a way to get along, to stick together through the Trump presidency and beyond, if it is going to make the gains of the Trump presidency, foreign and domestic, permanent.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And, it's, those people within the administration who fall into that category, who are the ones who are leaking to the New York Times, their animus for Netanyahu and claiming that that's the real spirit of the White House. I think they're part of this. But as you say, they have been losing these arguments within the White House. And, that is actually a natural segue to my next question. And I want to turn now to a topic that is creating a lot of dissension among conservatives. Many friends of Israel and Jews have been asking some of the leading voices on the right to condemn or disassociate themselves from people who have either platformed anti-Semitism or engaged in it themselves. And I'm, referring to Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens principally. But some, to name a couple of very prominent examples like Megyn Kelly and Matt Walsh, won't do it, and even take great offense at being at the request. What do you think of this controversy and what it says about the state of the conservative movement and where we're heading?
I don't know how deplatforming is supposed to work. And I think many of the voices who've moved in that direction have discredited themselves. It doesn't mean they don't have an audience anymore, but I think they've removed themselves from the conversation among serious people. I've invited Tucker Carlson to come on my show. I've offered to go into his. He doesn't respond. He won't have pro-Israel guests. He did have Ted Cruz, who's a senator. That's the only exception. He also had Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's very pro-Israel, but didn't ask him a single question about Israel because Tucker doesn't want to go there. And by the way, if you've ever seen Kennedy defend his views on Israel, he's incredible. He is probably more effective in articulating the pro-Israel argument than any full-time professional pro-Israel lobbyist. I mean, he's got a firm belief that Israel is in the right, and I think he's been vindicated.
He speaks for the liberal pro-Israel tradition, which is kind of extinct in the Democratic Party right now.
So I don't mind if Tucker has him on the show or if he goes on the show. It's just interesting to me that the one question Tucker won't talk about with him, but he wants to talk about with everybody else, is Kennedy's position on Israel. Now, it's actually important. Kennedy's position on Israel cost him a huge amount of political support when he was running his independent campaign for the presidency. And yet Tucker avoids it. He avoids me. He avoids people who could actually make an argument. Candace Owens, I think, has fallen off to the wayside for years now. And we've been very polite to one another, but I think she's really lost the plot, and her fulminations against things like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of the great towering religious figures of the 20th century and beyond, just expose a kind of pettiness. And people wonder where all this came from, because she was also in Israel in 2018 for the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem, and she was very pro-Israel. I think it stems from a sense of pride. I think she cornered herself with a series of arguments about 5 years or so ago. She then was attacked by the ADL, and instead of just moving on, I think she dug in. By the way, I think the same thing happened to Tucker Carlson. And I think the ADL has done a lot of damage. I don't want to just describe this problem to the ADL, because I think people are responsible for their own behavior. And so if Tucker and Candace took things the wrong way or took them to an extreme, that's their problem, not the ADL's problem. But in both cases, the ADL went after Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens before they had really said anything particularly objectionable. They then found themselves labeled unfairly by liberals who run the ADL as anti-Semites, and then that caused them to have a negative view of the Jewish community, for whom the ADL purports to speak, although it doesn't, in my view. But they then pushed back against the Jewish community as a whole. The same thing happened. There was a discussion people talked about a lot after Charlie Kirk's assassination, with Charlie Kirk and Megyn Kelly both complaining about the way they had been accused of anti-Semitism. And who accused them? It was the American Jewish Committee, another communal institution dominated by Democratic Party activists and donors. And the American Jewish Committee, which does at least somewhat plausibly purport to speak for the Jewish community as a whole, went after them, went after Charlie and Megyn. I think it was over their commentary on Jeffrey Epstein. It's such a small issue. I mean, the Jeffrey Epstein issue is so infinitesimally small. And for the American Jewish community to go after them because they speculated he might have been a foreign agent. I mean, before people knew more about him, there was no reason not to think he might be. I mean, he had a lot of foreign contacts. He had a close relationship with Ehud Barak, who was the former left-wing prime minister of Israel. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't speculate about these things. There's not any inherent anti-Semitism in that. But if you want to go and say, oh, well, that's an inherently anti-Semitic way of looking at the world in terms of all kinds of conspiracies, well, there are conspiracies. Sometimes they exist, and it's not a thought crime to ask questions about whether that's possible. And so I think that the way that some Jewish leaders and institutions have treated some of these people who might have been well-meaning, and certainly in Charlie's case he was, and I think in Megyn's case as well, maybe less so in Candace's case and so forth. But I think they've pushed people to an extreme, and I've told them that, and I've written that. I wrote several pieces going back several years defending Tucker Carlson when he was falsely being accused of anti-Semitism. Now, I think the case is more plausible, but again, he chose that road after he was forced out at Fox, partly because the ADL pushed for his firing. And I've also written that the Jewish community as a whole made a strategic blunder of historic proportions by taking a standoffish approach to Donald Trump. There's no American president who's done more for Jews, never mind just Israel, but done more for Jews than Donald Trump. And yet, until very recently, the only Jewish organization of any description that had honored him or thanked him in an official way was the Zionist Organization of America. You can add the Republican Jewish Coalition to that as well, but they're a political organization. The Zionist Organization of America, nonpartisan organization. Yes, it's conservative, but they gave Trump an award a few years ago for his work on behalf of Israel and the Jewish community. The mainstream institutions of the Jewish community who shower praise and dinners and awards and donations and philanthropy on all kinds of Democrats. I mean, think of the USC Shoah Foundation. Okay, it's not necessarily just a Jewish institution, but this is a Holocaust historical foundation, very worthy, at the University of Southern California. They gave Obama an award for stopping genocide. But Obama hadn't stopped any genocide. And at the time they gave him the award, he was busy turning the other way as the Syrian regime committed genocide in Syria, an actual plausible genocide, not like the fake claims lobbed at Israel. But they gave Obama an award, kind of like the Nobel Committee gave Obama the Peace Prize before he had done anything. So they shower awards on these undeserving but liberal and Democratic Party leaders, and they ignore Donald Trump. And I said that is going to have profoundly negative implications for the community, because you are telling half of our country, that the half that supports Donald Trump, that there's nothing he can possibly do that's good enough for the Jewish community to thank him. And so if there's no reward for people who do good things for the Jews and for Israel, why should there be any compunction about doing bad things? And again, I'm not excusing people who do bad things and say bad things, but we have set up a perverse incentive structure, and we've allowed our own institutions to be corrupted through various mechanisms by one point of view that is not representative either of America or even of the diverse array of views within the Jewish community. So I just to simplify it, I think Tucker Carlson was falsely accused of anti-Semitism until it became true. That's unfortunate, and I think that there's an opportunity now, perhaps, with this Gaza peace deal, which really is extraordinary in many ways, to reset. And I wrote on X during the time the deal was coming together, now is the time for people like Tucker and Candace to get back onto the winning side. You really don't want to be on the losing side of this peace deal. This peace deal could secure Israel's future. It will bring the hostages back, and it represents the success of a pro-Israel foreign policy. You don't want to be on the wrong side of Trump's greatest foreign policy success so far.
Yeah, well, I think what you said about the Jewish, sort of the organized Jewish community in Trump is completely right. I think their hostility to him is irrational. It's not in the interest of the Jewish community. I have to push back a bit against you with respect to Tucker Carlson and, the ADL. Now, I think there are very few people who have written with more hostility and with more criticism of the ADL than me. I mean, it's a short list, my friend Seth Mandel at Commentary and others like you. But I've been, I'm definitely, I'm in the conversation as the person who's been most critical about them. But, for Tucker Carlson, listen, and I've been writing about this even before, he was booted off of Fox News. From 8 to 9 p.m., that was the 1 hour on Fox News, during the Tucker Carlson show and the years that he was running it. And during which part of the time he really was a tribune of conservatism in the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020. I give him full credit for that. But, that was the hour on Fox News where the word Israel was never mentioned. His hostility to Israel is longstanding. And it sort of leaked out in many ways then. And it's just, he's just gone, off the deep end since then, platforming Holocaust denial and every anti-Israel person you could possibly think of, including people on the left. And, with respect to Candace Owens, she's just a lunatic anti-Semite at this point. Whatever she once was, whatever Tucker once was, 30 years ago, he was writing for the Weekly Standard, he was a neocon before it became unfashionable.
That is true. That's also very important.
So, when it comes, I'll blame the ADL for a lot, but not for turning, Tucker Carlson, into an anti-Semite. He did that all by himself. And I think there were plenty of us who suspected it long before it became as open as it is now.
So let me respond in a few ways to that. So certainly his decision to highlight Holocaust revisionist historians and anti-Semites and so forth, inexcusable. I mean, but it descended into parody in a way. George Stephanopoulos' sister, who's some kind of religious person in the Middle East, appeared on the Tucker Carlson show to disparage Israel, looking really strange. And I mean, it was almost it's absurd. It's self-parodying at this point. And the fact that he won't come on any pro-Israel show to defend himself, I think really allows people to judge his credibility on that issue. And I think the public actually have judged. People still tune into him because he is an iconoclast on so many other subjects. I want to say two things about your description of Tucker Carlson in the first Trump administration that I disagree with. So it's true that he didn't say much about Israel. It's also true there wasn't anything like this going on. And that's because Trump was so supportive of Israel that there were very few terror attacks. There was no campus movement against Israel of any description. There were no wars started against Israel. The only thing that came close was an attempt to storm the border. On the day that Trump moved the embassy, there were, I think, 62 Palestinians who were shot and killed at the border in Gaza as they tried to storm the border, almost all of whom were members of Hamas, perhaps a precursor, unfortunately, to October 7th. But at that day, the Israeli military was ready and waiting. And other than that, there was just nothing to talk about. I mean, that to me is the lesson that when Israel is strong and when the United States has a strong relationship with Israel, then a lot of these haters just disappear. The threats to Israel disappear. I think weakness is provocative. So there wasn't much for Tucker to say. I don't fault him for not talking about an issue that wasn't really an issue. I think you could say, well, he didn't dwell on the positive achievements, but
he would have Roger Waters on. He had Roger Waters, virulent anti-Semite, on his show when no one else would platform him. This is when he was on Fox News. He would not ask him about Israel because he knew, I think he knew very clearly that, going there would have hurt him with his core audience. Now he doesn't have to worry about that anymore because, and all the filters are gone. But, but of course, you're right.
Well,
we weren't where we were. We weren't then where we are now, for sure.
Well, let me say one other thing about your description of Tucker. I did not see him as a tribune of conservatism in those years. I felt like one of the only people who didn't. I liked Tucker generally, or I liked him, I guess, before his current, iteration. But I like him as a champion of free speech. I like the way he pushes back against conformity. And that's the part of Tucker Carlson's conservatism that still appeals to me. What I didn't like, especially during Black Lives Matter, was the way Tucker Carlson seemed to be expressing outrage at the Trump administration. Tucker would go on night after night of the riots and say, nobody's doing anything about this. They're tearing down statues and nobody's doing anything. And I would look at the television and say, Trump is trying. He just put in this new executive order to imprison people for 10 years, to enforce that existing federal law, imprison people for 10 years if they destroy a statue on federal property. I saw Trump doing everything Trump could do. And I saw what Tucker was doing. And I had conservative friends saying, hey, you got to watch Tucker. It's must-watch viewing every night. So I would watch and I'd say, this is demoralizing, actually. What Tucker is saying is that even the elected representative of conservatism, Donald Trump, is failing you. I felt it was defeatist. And I said, this is the last thing you need right now. The last thing you need is someone going on TV and telling Americans that nobody is standing for them. Trump took immense personal risk to stand up against this mob. He walked across Lafayette Square in a much maligned and poorly described and lied about event. But he walked across the square, stood in front of the burned out church and held the Bible. To me, that was the reason I voted for him. But the media ridiculed it as a photo op. I mean, what does a politician do that isn't a photo op? But they ridiculed him as a photo op. Biden falsely accused him of holding the Bible upside down, which never happened. And Tucker was dumping on the guy. And I thought, hang on, what's going on here? Later, I think during the Dominion lawsuit against Fox, it emerged that there had been text messages where Tucker was disparaging Trump, which confirmed
and his
my
employers, I might add.
Right, but
the Murdochs didn't take a joke about that. Yeah,
right. But to me, it confirmed what I had suspected, that Tucker had written off Trump as anyone capable of defending these ideals. Now, whatever his views are now, and Trump obviously likes him. I'm not trying to break up that relationship. Again, I'm all about keeping the band together. But I do think that Tucker Carlson was unfairly maligned. Again, it doesn't excuse things like putting Holocaust revisionists on his program in an uncritical way, or even worse. After the United States attacked Iran, he had, I think, the Iranian foreign minister on his show and didn't ask him anything challenging whatsoever. It was the biggest softball interview. He would never give any American politician that kind of a softball interview. It was sort of a Hanoi Hannah moment. I mean, just, again, another thing that just discredited him. I think that's going to happen to a lot of these voices over time, that they're just discrediting themselves. They don't need to be deplatformed, because the longer they persist in this idiocy, the less seriously they're taken. Tim Pool, who's a great podcaster, had Kanye West on his program when Kanye West was just coming out as an anti-Semite. Kanye West arrived with a whole bunch of other anti-Semites, with Nick Fuentes and so forth. And Tim Pool asked the mildest challenging question, polite, careful, but challenging. And Kanye West stormed off the set. And I said, this is the greatest thing ever to happen. He gave Kanye West the opportunity to debate, to defend his views, and he refused to do it. He left. So that's what's happening with Tucker. Tucker is refusing, in the same way that ABC and The View refuse to have conservative guests on their show. I mean, they're losing credibility. So I think the public, in a sense, have to judge whether or not these people are worth listening to about anything. I mean, Tucker, again, yes, he has a huge audience, but also keep in mind, he thinks aliens are real and that UFOs visit America. So we're worried here about the views on Israel of someone who thinks the little green men might have landed on the North Pole or something. I mean, I'm not ruling it out. It might happen. But I mean, you have to be free to make that kind of inquiry.
He has a UFO obsession, that's for sure, among his many ticks.
We have to have a media where you're free to have those things. And do I have crazy beliefs? Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that the Milwaukee Brewers were swept by the Los Angeles Dodgers because they waved the L flag after they beat the Cubs. My beloved Chicago Cubs, who wave a flag with a W after every win. The Milwaukee Brewers trolled them by waving an L flag for loser. And they lost every game after that to the Dodgers. Do I think that's divine intervention? Absolutely. That was a divinely ordained punishment of the Milwaukee Brewers. Now, I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but
listen, I'm going to ban sour grapes from Cubs fans. I'm not doing any sour grapes as a Yankee fan. So
my point is,
we'll leave the World Series winner, teams to their own fate.
I think Tucker's entitled to some of his ridiculous beliefs, but it does mean we are also entitled to weigh his other beliefs in light of those ridiculous beliefs. And I think that he is discrediting himself the longer he persists in this. I think there's time to change course, but it is damaging. And again, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to give people a reason to think outside of foreign policy and think outside of all this stuff and understand Israel as a positive influence in the world and a positive example. You don't even have to like Israel. Be Palestinian, but be a Zionist Palestinian. In other words, be the kind of Palestinian who wants to build a state rather than just destroy the neighbors next to you. That is a Zionist approach. And so I think it's good for Israel if people understand that that's what Israel's lesson really is.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point to segue back to your book. Let me just say, I'm not in favor of deplatforming people. I'm not in favor of shutting people up. I do think, it is not unreasonable to ask, people who, speak in the public square to condemn anti-Semitism when we see it. And I guess my question, just to drill down one last time about this issue, is when it comes to anti-Semitism, is this a where do you see, this sort of anti-Israel faction on the right? Is it, are we in this position just because conservatives are following Trump's example, where he never admits fault, never concedes anything to the left, never gives in on any point when whether it's some group of young Republicans caught in a group chat where they sound like Nazis and just don't give in to it, or and because he thinks rightly thinks he'll never get credit for it anyway, no matter what he says. Or is this a serious problem on the right, in terms of anti-Semitism that needs to be nipped in the bud by people of principle who have large platforms?
I think the answer is both. So on the one hand, it's not a huge problem. There was a survey done around the time of Trump's entry into the war in the Middle East and the bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites. And among self-described Trump supporters, support for American military action in Iran was 95% or 94%, and the opposition was 5 or 6%. So all of this fuss about anti-Semitism on the right might represent only 5 or 6% of Trump supporters. So
it's much more prominent on the left. There's no question.
Yeah, on the left, it's much more prominent. You can just look at the partisan split on Israel. At the same time, that 5 or 6%, let's just say for argument's sake, that's what it is. That 5 or 6% can be very influential and can be powerful and can cause a certain amount of damage. And I think what I would define as the damage it's causing is the same kind of brain rot that affected the left for a long time before anti-Semitism really exploded out into the open. What Tucker and others are saying is that Israel secretly controls American foreign policy. And if you believe that your life is secretly controlled by hidden forces or actors or factors completely beyond your control, then you can't succeed. You can't succeed and you become defeatist. The way Tucker was defeatist in 2020, okay, when the Black Lives Matter riots. Almost like it was as if he had given up on the country under present leadership. That's what I didn't like about it. And what Tucker is saying is that Israel controls the Pentagon. Well, if you believe that, it's ridiculous. But if you believe it and you start buying into it because it might explain one or two facts that you don't understand otherwise, because perhaps you haven't thought about other explanations, but if you start to believe that, then you become defeatist in a way that the left is defeatist, where the only point for the left now is to elect someone who's the mirror image of Trump. So a Zoran Mamdani who wants to bring the whole system down, or a Gavin Newsom who descends into insulting language because he thinks that's the essence of Trump's social media strategy. And that's a kind of political black hole from which there's no return. Everything gets sucked into that kind of negativism. So I think that the answer has to be to emphasize the positive. Yes, at some point you do need to get some boundaries. You have to put some boundaries around what a political organization is willing to tolerate. So I think people who use Nazi language and so forth need to be kicked out. People who give prominence to Holocaust deniers and so forth, they need to stop getting invitations to the White House Christmas party or whatever. I mean, I think at some point you stop associating yourself with certain views. A big tent still has walls, okay?
Yeah.
So at some point you do need to do what William F.
It's not too much to ask, honestly.
Yeah, at some point you do. But I also think that you have to emphasize the positive and understand that most people are drawn to these beliefs because there's something about their experience of the world that's not explained in any other way. And I think for many Christian Americans, I can't speak for them, but it's just from my interactions with really committed people who care about the country and who want to care about Israel but are struggling to do so, I think they feel silenced by a popular culture that leaves no room for expressions of faith and no room for expressions of patriotism. Then they look at Israel and they look at not just the fact that Israelis express faith and patriotism, but that American politicians go to Israel and share those sentiments abroad that they might not share at home. That's the criticism, for example, of Mike Johnson, who I think is a very committed evangelical, but they say, look, he goes to Israel, he's no problem, or Republicans who believe we should help Ukraine. They'll salute the Ukrainian flag, but they won't put the American flag outside their office. Much bigger problem for Democrats than Republicans. But I think people feel like they are struggling to find a way to express themselves, to be fully who they are in American society. And what I would say to them is, nobody can stop you from doing that. Nobody can stop you. The Israelis aren't stopping you. The people who topple statues, they're not stopping you. Nobody is actually stopping you from doing this. You can achieve this full expression of nationalism and faith that you desire and that you deserve, and you don't need to make it contingent on anybody else. And that's the secret to survival that Israel had to discover, that Israel ultimately has to defend itself. It cannot rely on the United States as much as it appreciates the help. Israel ultimately had to fight, and I do believe some of the decisions Netanyahu took were without Trump's knowledge or approval. He had to go into Gaza City, for example, or maybe even the attack on Qatar, which Trump might have been informed about later. But there are various things that Netanyahu had to do independently for Israel's own self-interest. And that's the secret of Israeli survival, is sometimes you do have to just stand up for yourself. There's nothing that stops Americans from doing the same. We don't have to believe someone else is preventing that. And so that's what I would say is a message. Don't get hung up on these hidden hand theories. There's the invisible hand of Adam Smith, where there's a kind of social cohesion that lifts everybody. And then there's the hidden hand of Karl Marx, which is that there are forces secretly operating to keep everybody down. And you can think about the world that way, maybe even explains a few things, but it is ultimately personally and socially debilitating.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, Joel, we're out of time. There were more questions I wanted to ask, but we'll have to get to them the next time we have you on the show. Tell our audience where they can, find your book and how they can follow your work at Breitbart.
You can follow me very easily on X at Joel Pollak, JoelPollak, no C. And the book is on Amazon.com. The Zionist Conspiracy Wants You. And it's had a very good reception. And thank you very much for having me on to talk about it.
Oh, thank you, Joel. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, and also to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any one of those various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.